has the bankruptcy of leadership among politicians in the United Kingdom put the people of that country between a rock and a very hard place? Why is the police arresting former felons in the US state of Florida on trumped-up charges of voter fraud? And is the Australian mining industry really as safe as it claims to be? These are some of the questions we'll look at on this episode of Daily Debrief with me, Siddhant Ani. We're coming to you from the People's Dispatch studios here in New Delhi. First up, Lizz Truss made front page news in many parts of the world as she set a world record for the shortest stint as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Social media memers and trolls had a field day, but serious economic issues underline the political crisis unfolding within both the Conservative Party and UK polity at large. The jokes ranged from counting all things Truss had buried during her short run, including the British pound and perhaps the Tory party itself. But that comes with a bit more than just optimism. Others suggested that 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister's official residence, is now available for short-stay vacations. In real life, though, households across the UK are struggling with bills and debts, including mortgage payments, as well as energy bills, of course, that are soaring because of the overall conditions of inflation. And with winter coming and no agreement on the price caps in Europe, the worst is yet to come. People's Dispatch's Prashant is in studio with me now with more details. Prashant, good to be sitting in the studio with you again after what seems like an awfully long time. And we're talking about what looks like another nail in the coffin of the Tory party, of course. What led to Liz Truss's resignation? You sort of called it on the show last week when we were talking about the ongoing crisis. But what were the events that led up to the resignation coming in last night?
Right, Siddharth, it's a bit of a, it's not a bit, it's a huge farce actually if you consider what has been happening in the Conservative Party and the British government for the past 45 days odd, which is her term. Liz Truss is now the shortest serving British Prime Minister ever. But what sparked this was a series of events. The most recent event was the fact that on Wednesday, which is the day before she resigned, there was complete chaos in the House of Commons as the Labour Party tried to bring a bill seeking to have a say in the policy on fracking. Now, the Conservatives have endorsed fracking, which will cause a lot of damage to the environment. There was a lot of confusion in the party whether this was a vote just about fracking, whether it was actually a vote of confidence in the government. There were accusations of MPs being bullied, threatened, physically, pushed and pulled and all that, and there was complete chaos, a lot of disappointment in the party, and this was pretty much the last straw. Because what we have seen in the past 45 days is Liz Truss hurtling from one disaster to the other. We know that a substantial part of her 45 days, about 10 days or so, was just during the mourning period for Queen Elizabeth II, so there was not actually government activity taking place during that time.
Right.
So her actual tenure in power was even lesser. And then we had this disaster of a mini budget where she and her Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng openly, the most open fashion possible, declared that they were going to reduce taxes on the richest in various ways, including removing a particular tax cap, including cutting down corporation taxes. So this happening on one hand. On the other hand, the Conservatives were getting ready to wage an all-out war on trade unions, on striking workers, etc., giving provisions which would make strikes and labour action even more difficult and would in fact criminalize labour action. All this happening at a time when there was really no solution to the cost of living crisis. Inflation touched 10%. Food inflation was at 15%, the highest since the 1980s. Winter's coming. There's a huge mortgage crisis people are going to face. So at every level, the population was facing a massive crisis. The poor especially were facing a crisis. The workers were, angry over, the fact that pay rises are not being calculated according to inflation. The fact that their avenues of protest are being cut down one by one. On the other hand, you had the Home Secretary Suella Braverman continuing with the anti-immigrant, anti-refugee policy that the previous government was also had introduced. Yeah. So Amit, also basically this was a government which was saying that for the rich we're going to give you more benefits, we're going to make things easier for you. In fact, there was also a proposal to remove restrictions on bankers' bonuses. Now, if a government is pro-banker this time and age, you really know where the winds are blowing. So there was this government which is saying we are going to help the rich as much as possible, and we are, forget the rest. And this comes out of a completely discredited orthodoxy of economics, where people believe somehow that as long as the rich are well off, enough the wealth will trickle down. That old discredited theory. But Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng and people of their ilk truly believe in it, to the extent that even some of the rich were concerned, right? So, their policies set in motion a collapse of the pound, a collapse of markets. All this together was a recipe for disaster. So, it's no surprise that the British newspaper put a bet whether the lettuce would last longer or Liz Truss' prime ministerial term would last longer, because the writing was definitely on the wall. And the incidents on Wednesday in the House of Commons were pretty much the last straw, nail in the coffin, so to speak.
Yeah. Looking ahead, Prashant, we've seen opposition leaders, the Scotland sort of First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, of course, Labour's Keir Starmer, calling for elections and saying that people must now decide how their future or who will govern their future. What are the prospects on that front? What is the Tory party looking at doing? Because they're talking about another leadership sort of solution, and I'm not sure where they are manufacturing new leadership from.
Exactly. It's become like a revolving door, as I think the Labour leader has said. But a couple of things to note here. One, it has become increasingly more difficult for an election to be called because of certain laws that were passed in recent times. So that way, because the Conservatives, as they have a majority, are far more immune from having to hold their election at this point of time, which is what has enabled them to go through this policy of just changing leaders, despite the fact that their popularity is at an all-time low. The popularity of Labour is, Labour seems to be leading by a substantial margin. The fact that Boris Johnson, who just a few months ago was completely discredited, suddenly seems to emerge as a candidate once again. Even the possibility of that shows how bankrupt the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom is when it comes to leadership, when it comes to policy solutions. So that's on one hand. On the other hand, we do know that there have been calls for elections across the board. The unfortunate thing, of course, is that Labour itself, and we've talked about this many times on this show, does not really offer any substantial alternative to the Conservatives in many ways. For instance, they may not be as reactionary in some of their economic policies, but nonetheless, they stick to very much the same policy principles. In fact, there's been widespread anger over the fact that Keir Starmer, who spoke to the Trade Union Congress meeting recently, I think he refused to commit to a pay hike which is based on inflation. And now this is a demand which is happening in many countries across Europe, because the government, for instance, they're offering pay hikes. But these are pay hikes which are not related to the rate of inflation, and unions are making a very reasonable demand. When inflation is soaring at this level, your pay hikes cannot be that needs to be factored in your pay hikes. And so that shows the extent to which the Labour leadership is also pretty much in line with the Conservatives on many of these policies and principles. So we also know, of course, that the Labour leadership right now stays in power by sidelining Jeremy Corbyn and his supporters, who were actually the people who brought an entire generation of new young people into Labour, who seem to actually offer a different political alternative. So they have been sidelined, and the current Labour leadership is pretty much on the lines of Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, the same people who brought many of these crises. So, it's important. I mean, while Labour is in the lead right now, there's no doubts about it. And like I said, while they may not stick to the same orthodoxy as the Conservatives are, there's no real answer from the Labour as to what they might offer. So right now, unfortunately, it does look like the Conservatives are probably going to elect another Prime Minister, who will pretty much is likely to continue almost exactly the same policies, because there is no appetite for a course correction as far as any of the candidates. If you see Rishi Sunak, if you see Penny Mordaunt, if you see Boris Johnson, I don't think any of them are planning for a major course correction. All of them advocate austerity policies of some sorts or the other. All of them are likely to continue with the same anti-refugee policy. All of them are likely to endorse the same attacks on union and Labour. All of them are likely to, for instance, prefer to allow more wealth for the rich people in some way or the other. The specifics might differ. So unfortunately, it doesn't look like that for the people of the UK, who might be facing one of the biggest crises in decades, the Conservative Party has much to offer.
All right. Thanks very much for that update, Prashant. Ridiculous is how even some police officers are describing orders to arrest felons on charges of voting illegally in the southern US state of Florida. Governor Ron DeSantis announced proudly a crackdown on voter fraud. Newly revealed body cam footage from some of the police involved in arrests show that those charged are confused and angry because they believed they had been allowed to vote after serving the sentences for the crimes they were convicted of. Much of this confusion seems the administration's deliberate attempt to exploit grey areas in an amendment to state voting laws that allows certain ex-felons to vote, except in cases involving murder and sexual crimes. An analysis of those arrested shows quite clearly that the entire so-called crackdown is another one of DeSantis' bizarre political games. Natalia Marquez has been in the thick of this story and spoke to me earlier via video conference. Natalia, thanks for joining us for details on a story that you've been covering yourself and you're also writing about for People's Dispatch. Firstly, just lay it out for us. What exactly is this Office of Election Crime and Security up to in Florida? What seems to be the purpose behind it? Because clearly it's not as idealistic and objective as to clean up the electoral system.
Yeah, so this is a new Office of Election Crimes and Security. It was created in July. So, on August 18th, Ron DeSantis announced that this office had arrested 20 people for alleged voter fraud. These people were all people that were formerly incarcerated. And in Florida, it is legal for people who have committed felonies to vote, but only if they don't have any murder or sexual related charges. And through this loophole, a lot of people are able to essentially slip through the cracks, or only a few people rather. So it's a very confusing, convoluted process. The voter registration forms don't mention at all that there's this significant caveat to the law that allows formerly incarcerated people to vote. And all of these 20 people or 19 people, however many, were people who were formerly incarcerated and had committed those charges, but had been told that they could, in fact, register to vote by government employees. Because the law is so convoluted, a lot of people in the Florida government themselves, like regular public service employees, don't necessarily know that there's this exception to the rule. And so, the body camera footage from these arrests of these 20 people recently came out. It was recently published just on October 18th, I believe. And it shows, people being very surprised and incredulous that police are coming up to them with a warrant for arrest because they voted, right? As if voting is a crime. So people's reactions are very visceral. They don't understand. The police are telling them that, they have $1,000 bonds for voting. It's very jarring. And recently when this video came out, people across the US were outraged that, people are even being arrested for voting after they're told explicitly that they can vote.
In terms of a sort of a social and cultural perspective on this, commentators are calling it either a throwback to or a modern version of, or a contemporary version of the Jim Crow South, Natalia. How do you view all of this, also, of course, in the context of the upcoming midterms?
Well, yes, for a long time in the US, up until now, there have been a lot of laws that still exist that really disenfranchise Black people and people of color in the United States. One of the key factors of this is that in almost all states, voting rights are restricted in some way, due to someone's incarceration or former incarceration status. And so, people who have committed crimes, have committed felonies, are restricted from voting. And this affects around 5.2 million people. So that's a lot of people in the US that are prohibited from voting as of 2020. And so this is something that's existed for a long time, right? And it specifically does disenfranchise Black voters because Black people occupy a disproportionate population of the US prison system. And so this is, a legacy in many ways of the Jim Crow laws immediately following the Reconstruction era, where Southern states implemented poll taxes or literacy tests to voting. So specific barriers that would disproportionately affect Black voters who most of them did not know how to read, could not afford a poll tax. And so this is, in many ways, critics argue that these laws that prohibit formerly incarcerated people from voting are very similar, if not the same concept. And now, that Florida is really cracking down on these formerly incarcerated people who voted. People are really comparing it to, the Jim Crow South, where Black voters were intimidated out of the voting process. What also adds to this is that Florida passed Amendment 4 in 2018, which allowed formerly incarcerated people to vote if they did not commit murder or sexual offenses, and also if they had paid off all their court fees and fines. And so people compared that to a poll tax because it essentially puts a financial barrier to the process of voting.
Right. And all this, of course, happening in a nation that prides itself as being the land of the free and sort of upholding democracy in all the world. So making it that much more important. Thank you, Natalia, for covering that story and for sharing the details with us. And finally, the deaths of 2 miners and other incidents in the past few days have put the focus back on Australia's mining industry, an industry that's generally been treated well by successive governments and considers itself a world leader, particularly in the context of worker safety. Scratch below the surface though, and you'll find that not all is hunky-dory. People's Dispatch's Anish has been doing exactly that. Anish, over the past week or so, a series of very unfortunate accidents or incidents taking place at various Australian mines, bringing into focus an industry that claims to be a world leader in terms of both productivity as well as safety and working conditions for miners at these sites. Yet these incidents of individual sort of accidents and fatalities continue to occur in Australian mines. Tell us first what exactly these incidents have been and what circumstances they've taken place in.
Well, the 2 incidents happened in a span of 3 days. Actually, it happened in this week itself, and it's already reaching the same level of fatality rate as last year. Obviously, last year Western Australia especially, saw 3 deaths, and this year we already have 2. So in both of these cases, the workers that have died are contract workers, what are called as contractors, and both of them are part of this what is called as fly-in and fly-out arrangement, where they are sent to distant mines away from the cities that they're living in for a span of between 14 and 21 days. And so they have to continuously work with all those days. The working hours may be longer, and it kind of is a problem in general for the industry. Another factor is that while the Australian government and the mining companies have stated that they're conducting an investigation into the matter, the Australian Workers Union has stated that it has not been allowed access to these sites of the accident. In fact, St. Ives camp, where the latest incident happened, has already started work and has resumed its operations and mining. And the accident happened just 2 days ago. And it is even more concerning that unions are not allowed to investigate this matter independently, because we have seen in the past, when it comes to Australia, the Australian government, be it at the state or at the federal level, have often been quite soft on the mining industry. There are multiple workplace protection and safety acts, including Industrial Manslaughter Act, which protects people and workers, especially those working in such hazardous conditions, such as a mine or an exploration drill site, and so on. They are supposed to be protected under this act, and so a serious investigation needs to be taken place. But in most of the cases, the investigations kind of continue without an end, or they are just closed by saying that it's an accident that could not be prevented by any kind of industry workplace safety standards. So both of these cases are still a problem. Unions are still not allowed, and it kind of is a problem that is widespread across the industry.
So what are unions at this point demanding, and what are the experts on the safety side saying that can be done?
Well, the experts are quite right in many ways, because if you look at the fact that a number of contract workers, especially, not permanent workers as much, but contract workers who right now, according to several estimates, constitute pretty much more than half of the working hours in the mining sector, the entirety of the mining sector. So these workers pretty much are usually overworked, and they do all sorts of work at a mine, and including transport. So in a certain ways, there is a case to be made for overwork being done, especially since contractors are cheaper to hire, and are paid less compared to the permanent hires that they have on the site, who have longer breaks and leaves between their shifts, so which gives them ample time to rest and come back with a better have better quality of life in general, which is not something that is afforded to contract workers. The unions have been trying to unionize many of them, but that has not been successful. We have seen attempts being made to include these contractors as part of the employee section, so that they can get the same kind of protections that other permanent employees do, but that has also not happened. On the larger scale, if you look at it, just because 2 deaths have happened that we know about these 2 incidents, the thing is that dozens of such incidents happen across Western Australia in the mining sector, and very little is being done. There is no investigation at all to begin with. Obviously, even the ones that get investigated, as I said, just go into cold storage after a while. Last year in June, there was an accident, and a death happened, and that the investigation still continues, and there has literally been no response from the state government on the matter.
Thanks very much for underlining all of the sort of broader issues that relate to the industry, but also for highlighting how important it is for there to be transparency when these incidents do take place and investigations are conducted by the authorities. Thanks again. That's all we have on this episode of Daily Debrief. From Manish, myself, and the entire team here at People's Dispatch, we thank you very much for watching. As always, we invite you to head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, for more details on these stories as well as all of the other work we do. And of course, don't forget to follow us on the social media platform of your choice. We'll be back tomorrow with a week-ending episode of the Daily Debrief, so we'll see you then. Until then, stay safe. Goodbye.